From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this series, we talk to specialists from Deloitte about the latest business issues. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views, and today we're recording a special tax policy edition to discuss what we might expect from a tax policy perspective following the 2024 presidential election. Joining me are my frequent guests on tax policy topics, John Traub and Anna Taylor. Both are from Deloitte's National Tax Policy Group. And before we dive into the election outcomes, Anna, get us started. Remind us why 2025 is being called the Super Bowl of tax and why this is going to be front and center for those taking power next year.
Well, on day one next year, policymakers are going to have to deal with all of the TCJA provisions that are expiring at the end of 2025. So what that means, expiration of all of the individual provisions, the individual rates, the expanded standard deduction, the expanded child tax credit, AMT relief, estate and gift rules, the pass-through deduction. Plus, on the business side, they're going to need to figure out how they want to deal with some of the provisions that have expired or have been in the process of expiring over the last couple of years. Section 174, R&E, 163J, and bonus depreciation. And then there's the international pieces from TCJA that are still stepping down in value over the next couple of years too. So we're looking at a price tag with all of those pieces that's upwards of $4.5 trillion. That's before potentially doing away with the SALT deduction cap, currently set to expire, or adding any of the new policies that have been talked about out on the campaign trail. So when you add this all up, it's a massive undertaking that they're going to have to figure out next year.
Clearly a lot at stake. So that brings us where we are today. So after months of campaigning, the votes are in, and we now know who our next president will be. So John, remind us what sort of tax platform our once and now future President Donald Trump campaigned on.
Well, let me say this. Taxes were not front and center in the campaign for the presidency. They played a supporting role at best. To the extent that President Trump talked about taxes, he obviously led with the idea of making permanent all the items from TCJA that Anna referenced, although he did at one point say he was going to do away with the SALT cap, which, as she noted, would make the $4.6 trillion 10-year cost even higher. And then he added a bunch of other ideas out there that were in supplement to that. So a lower corporate tax rate to 15% for companies that make products in America. He proposed to eliminate taxes on Social Security benefits. He proposed to eliminate income taxes on tips and overtime pay. It was unclear whether that would apply to only income taxes or also payroll taxes. A new tax deduction for the, quote, major costs associated with the newborn babies. A deduction for costs paid by individuals to install power generators, a proposal he came up with in the wake of devastation we saw in the southeastern U.S. due to hurricanes in the last couple of months. A new deduction for interest paid by individuals to buy domestic but not foreign-made automobiles. And he mentioned briefly last week the idea of a new tax credit for family caregivers. So as Anna would point out, that's if Congress would do all those things, and many of them were laid out only in the broadest terms on the campaign trail, that is several billion dollars in addition to the starting point of the price of extending TCJA.
Well, I agree. That is quite a list and very expensive, which is a topic I want to come back to. But before we get there, Anna, tax law depends on Congress. And so will we have a Congress that's interested in passing the president's agenda, or are they going to have their own ideas around tax policy?
Well, I think we can say with a pretty fair amount of certainty at the time that we're recording this, that there's going to be a Republican Senate that's going to be pretty closely aligned with President Trump on the goal of extending those TCJA policies. You've got a finance committee chairman and Mike Crapo, along with whoever the new Senate majority leader is going to be, whether it's John Thune or John Cornyn, all very involved in writing TCJA in 2017. And I think they probably feel as much ownership over those policies as a Trump administration will feel over them. So they'll be close allies in that effort. If there's a Republican House, which is still up in the air at the time of this recording, I think it's likely they'll also share a lot of the same priorities too, even though there are probably fewer Ways and Means members who participated in the 2017 process simply because they weren't in Congress yet. But my one question really is going to be, if there's a Republican sweep scenario, isn't whether they're going to largely support many of the TCJA policies, but are they going to feel the need to offset those policies? And if so, to what degree? And then in terms of the new policies, I think that while you haven't heard a lot from congressional Republican leaders yet on many of those policies, but I do think that they'll obviously want to work with their incoming administration on any of the policies that the new president wants to pursue. And look, if Democrats take the majority in the House, it's a very different conversation. Democrats are going to want to prioritize extension of the TCJA policies only for those making under $400,000. And they're also going to want to add in some sort of large expansion on the child tax credit. So that's clearly a more difficult, probably more drawn out negotiation that would happen if that were to be the case.
So those items that we've talked about in the past, things like using budget reconciliation to speed the passage of a bill or using a filibuster in the Senate, all those things, it sounds like, are dependent on these uncalled House races.
Yeah, for sure. A ton now hangs on 5, 7, 8, 9 races out on the West Coast as to whether or not Republicans are going to be able to go it alone, or whether the Democrats will have a very large seat at the table to demand that their policy priorities get considered here. And so even though the national press may be most focused on the presidency and to some extent on the Senate, really what's going on in the counting in these districts around the country is super important to what we see on tax policy in the next 12 months.
So let's say that the House is ultimately retained by Republicans. So we have a Republican sweep in control of all three branches. Let's get into what budget reconciliation is. And Anna, I know you lived through the challenges and possibilities that reconciliation can represent the last time it was used in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act back in 2022. Can you walk us through how it might work and how the procedural rules around it might limit what can be passed this time?
Sure. So the use of the budget reconciliation process is a powerful tool if they have control of both the House and the Senate, because it'll allow them to fast track consideration of a tax package through the Senate floor and avoid the filibuster process. To do so, the House and the Senate first have to pass a budget resolution. And that's a really important part of the process because that resolution itself has to include the reconciliation instructions with a revenue target. So they have to decide on the front end of this process what their revenue target is. That requires a little bit of backing into your final deal on the front end. So it's not a terribly easy thing to do, but that'll be the first step in the process. Then once they have that revenue target, within that revenue target, they can do a lot of things. They can raise or cut spending. They can raise or cut revenues, but they have to do that all first thing. Then there are some procedural limitations in terms of the content that they can include in a reconciliation bill when they get to the second part of the process. The provisions can't increase the deficit in the out years of the budget window. So that's why you see at TCJA, you see these individual provisions expiring, because that part of the reason for that policy decision was an out year problem with costs post 2025 when they were writing TCJA. You also cannot make any changes to Social Security policy in a reconciliation bill. So anything they wanted to do in that space couldn't be included here. And the revenue impact of any provision can't be merely incidental to the policy included. So say you have a policy, it does have a revenue impact, it has a revenue score on the line, and that revenue score can even be a big revenue score. If the Senate parliamentarian were to say that the goal of the policy wasn't to change revenues, but was instead for the policy itself, then that would not be allowed under the reconciliation process. There is a really good example of that from the American Rescue Plan that the Democrats passed in 2021. They tried to include a minimum wage increase in that package. It did have a big revenue impact, but the parliamentarian said that the policy outweighed the revenue impact and therefore it couldn't be included. So all that to say, there are limits to how you can do what you can put in and decisions you have to make on the front end with regards to your budget number. But if you can figure all that out, the process itself is really useful. It can move very fast. Democrats started their American Rescue Plan process in 2021. As soon as they came into Congress in January, they quickly started moving through the process. And I think that bill was signed into law in like mid-March. It was definitely in March. So that's probably the fastest that the process could go, but it does give them the ability to move rather swiftly once they determine what they're trying to do.
But we talked about the cost of this earlier, right? And so given this sort of framework that you just described, but also these massive revenue impacts of extending all of the items as well as adding any additional items from the campaign, what do we think Congress is going to do? Are they going to insist on paying for some or all of the cost of the Tax Cuts and Job Act extensions, plus any additional policies? How are they going to treat that element of it?
Well, I think that there's definitely going to be members who are focused on the deficit impact. If you think back even to 2017 and TCJA, there were Senate Republicans part of that process who insisted on paying for part of the package. So I do think that there will be a conversation about how much of the package needs to be offset. But look, raising taxes, cutting spending, much more difficult to do politically than cutting taxes and raising spending. So members are going to have to really thoughtfully figure out what the bottom line impact is when they put all of these pieces of the puzzle together to determine how important and what priority fiscal responsibility is going to play in this negotiation.
So, John, if Congress does decide to pay for this with higher taxes elsewhere, where are they going to look?
So there are a few ways to make the numbers line up the way you want. One, of course, is to do a smaller extension, either by paring some provisions out of the bill or by doing it for fewer years to make it look less expensive. But if there's a decision that they're going to be made to pay for it, even in a Republican alignment, where they're using reconciliation, I do think Anna's right there. There would be some effort to include some revenue raisers. One of the ones that we've been talking about for a long time is a cap or a limit on the deduction for corporate SALT payments. That is, if you've decided as a policy matter that uncapped SALT deductions for individuals is a bad idea, maybe there shouldn't be uncapped deductions for corporations. I think some Republicans could get behind the idea of expanding the limits on executive compensation in 162M. I could see maybe some Republicans agreeing to expand the excise tax on stock buybacks created in the Inflation Reduction Act. And we know Republicans will look for ways to pare back some of the provisions from the Inflation Reduction Act. They won't repeal it in its entirety, but there may be some pieces they can skinny down. And of course, if Democrats have a seat at the table because they win the House, then the profile of what's on the table is slightly different. At that point, I think IRA rollbacks are not on the table at all. But I do think other provisions that broaden the base, including potentially Pillar 2 compliance, become part of the discussion.
So, Anna, what are some of the early actions we should be looking for as we see this debate unfold?
Well, I'd go back to our conversation about the budget reconciliation process. So if there's a Republican sweep and Republicans control the House, I think you can expect and be looking for a really quick process of a budget resolution in January. If for some reason we end up in a scenario where Democrats have a seat at the table in the House, I think it's going to look a lot different. You maybe won't see as quick of movement, and it'll be more of the sides trying to fill each other out a little bit. I'd look for what kind of early conversations are happening between Chairman Richard Neal in the House and Chairman Mike Crapo in the Senate? Are they working well together? Are they trying to figure out the path forward together? Or are they each going to just lay out their own dueling versions of the world? So yeah, I'll be looking to see first, if it's all Republican, how quickly do they think they can process a reconciliation bill? And if not, if it's a bipartisan negotiation, how much communication and back and forth and collaboration are we going to see between Chairman Neal and Chairman Crapo?
One last question, John. Next week, Congress comes back for the lame duck session. Is this an opportunity to maybe see some action on the bills that have stalled previously to address things like Section 174 and bonus depreciation and Section 163J? Is this an opportunity for those to move forward?
I wouldn't say never, Carrie, but to me, the odds are very small. I don't think we're setting up a situation where there's going to be tremendous interest in an extended lame duck session. I don't think that the concerns that Senate Finance Committee Ranking Member Mike Crapo, soon to be chairman, had with the bill have gone away. There won't be an opportunity to reopen it for negotiation. So I'm skeptical. There are two pieces of that bill that we could see move separately, potentially. One is a provision to prevent double taxation of companies working in Taiwan. That's there's some strong bipartisan support. That maybe gets pulled out and moved on its own. There also could be maybe an effort to move some disaster tax pieces, especially in the wake of what we saw with hurricanes in the Southeast in the last few weeks. That maybe is a situation that could move on its own. But I think the broader package with 174 and bonus, I think that's pretty close to dead and buried right now.
All right. Well, thank you both. I'm sure we will be talking again soon as these developments start to unfold. And thank you to our audience for listening. If you'd like more information, I'd encourage you to go to Deloitte.com and search under Tax News and Views. You can sign up for our electronic newsletter if you haven't done so already. You can also reach out to Jonathan and Anna via LinkedIn. And I look forward to connecting with you all the next time. Take care, everyone. Be well.